People often say that empires fall to the sound of cannons. But tonight, I'll tell you about an empire that did not fall because of war, but because of a thin ribbon of smoke, lighter than a strand of hair. No enemy army broke its walls. Only millions of souls quietly opened the door for their own destroyer to walk in. In the early 19th century, China was still the center of the world, where tea, silk, and white porcelain made all of Europe bow its head. But then, from the silent holds of ships off the coast of Canton, a small kind of cargo slipped into every street, every village. Quieter than guns, but killing slower and deeper than any bullet. If you love the kind of stories that make history feel close, soft, and almost like a dream, maybe leave a subscription. So tomorrow night, we can sit together again and listen to another chapter of time. In the early 19th century, while the West was still wrestling with revolutions and the rise of industry, China stood like a world of its own. Calm, closed, self-satisfied, and so wealthy that it seemed nothing could ever shake it. A third of all global goods came from this land. Fragrant tea, shining silk, porcelain white as the moon, flowed out of Canton to every continent, leaving European kings both craving and confused. What they needed, China had. What they made, iron, wool, machines, the Chinese barely cared for. The empire still believed that beyond the Great Wall were barbarians, that all under heaven revolved around the central plain, that even time itself must bow to a civilization of 1,000 years. Canton was the only gate through which the outside world was allowed to touch China. Every deal had to pass through a few special merchants, men known as the Hong, Hao Qua. They were not just traders, they were gatekeepers of an entire civilization. Even a small mistake in silver pricing or in the way one greeted them could be taken as an insult to the Celestial Empire. Westerners, especially the British, had to bring silver bar by bar to exchange for tea and silk. Year after year, ships heavy with cargo left Canton carrying the scent of tea and the shine of porcelain, while in the vaults of London the chests of silver slowly emptied. That river of silver flowed one way, eastward. China needed almost nothing from outside. No technology, no machinery, no weapons. They believed permanence was the root of endurance. The Qing Empire, rich but shut, proud but unaware, did not see that beyond the gates of Canton another world was changing every day. Faster, hungrier, more ambitious than they imagined. That prosperity was like the light of late afternoon. Still warm, still glowing, but inside the gold there was already a hint of evening chill. No one knew that just a few decades later, the docks, once full of silver and tea, would be filled with gun smoke, and the ships that once carried goods across the world would become carriers of another commodity, one that would dissolve an empire. History does not always need a bullet to begin a collapse. Sometimes it only needs a habit, a craving, and a quiet belief that we will always stand above. The more British ships arrived in Canton, the clearer a paradox became. The strongest empire on Earth at the time, Great Britain, was draining its silver reserves just to exchange for tea and silk. That elegant drink had become a habit across the misty island kingdom, and every cup of morning tea in London was one more drop of silver flowing east. In the damp meeting rooms of London, merchant officials and nobles began to feel uneasy. They had steamships, cannons, fleets crossing every ocean. Yet they still had to bow before a handful of Chinese traders, waiting for permission to trade through a single gate. Canton. The British understood that if they could not reverse this river of silver, their trade system would collapse. They needed a commodity the Chinese could not refuse, something they would willingly pay silver for, the way Europeans once craved tea. So, inside the ledgers of merchant houses, a thought began to sprout, thin but dangerous. They looked toward India, where opium fields turned golden brown under the sun, and they wondered, if the Chinese do not want our goods, then what about something that makes them forget goods altogether? No need for guns, no need for invasion. Just sow an addiction, and the Chinese people themselves would open the door. A solution that looked clever but smelled of disaster. Because sometimes an empire does not fall to defeat, but to a hunger that cannot be filled, the hunger of greed and arrogance. If you are still awake, maybe tap subscribe, so that tomorrow night, when we continue this journey, you will hear about that dark commodity that traded silver for shadow across an empire. In smoke-filled offices in Calcutta, British men sat around wooden tables staring at trade maps spread wide. At the center of those maps was not a road, but a flower, small, thin, pale purple, the opium poppy, a plant once used in medicine to ease pain, to lull people to sleep, to soften suffering. But in human hands, it was about to become the most valuable commodity of the century. The British East India Company controlled the growing and regulation of opium in India. They planted it across endless fields in Bengal, where Indian farmers bent low to score the pods, letting the white sap bleed out like tears, drying into black gold, a kind of gold that would make all of Asia tremble. At first, opium entered China under the name of a sedative, but very quickly it became a secret pleasure of the aristocracy, then spread to merchants, soldiers, and even the poor. One inhale, a few minutes of floating, and worries and exhaustion melted like mist. Western traders built a quiet, sophisticated network. Fast ships, a transfer port off Linton Island, a web too slippery for the Qing state to control. Silver bars began flowing out of China again, quietly and steadily, like the breath of the sea. In Canton, luxurious houses began to rise, and nighttime parties drowned in smoke. Officials once strict and serious now reached for the pipe when darkness fell. A whole society, once proud of its morals, was slipping into the soft illusion of white smoke. No guns, no armies. An empire was lulling itself with poison, and the British, from afar, simply counted silver, like a sower calmly watching deadly flowers bloom on someone else's soil. From that moment, the Silver River reversed direction. China's addiction became Britain's profit. A cold equation whose result was not just economic, but the soul of a nation. Sometimes the darkest things do not arrive with explosions, but with a quiet sigh like wind. And by the time you realize you are falling, the addiction has been tightening its grip for a long time. By the 1820s, something strange was happening. The river of silver that once flowed into China, the symbol of its prosperity, was now flowing back out. Quietly, steadily, like a vein whose blood has been forced to run in reverse. From the trading posts along the Pearl River, silver left the country in exchange for a dull, opaque product, wrapped in dark cloth, weighing less than a few kilos, but worth the price of a lifetime. Opium had become the real currency of the age. Silver prices soared. Taxes fell short. People hid silver inside their homes, afraid it would lose value tomorrow. The Imperial treasury ran thin, while hollow-eyed addicts appeared everywhere, from soldiers to merchants to officials. No gunfire, No declared war, just families rotting from within, villages losing their strength. One official wrote in his ledger, "Our people work all year to earn a few bars of silver, then use that same silver to buy something that makes them forget to work." Simple words, but inside them was the entire tragedy of an empire eating itself alive. In the West, trading companies rejoiced. Profits rose, ships arrived on schedule, silver returned to Britain, turned into revenue, turned into power. And in London, at elegant tea parties, no one knew that every fragrant cup was paid for by thousands of lives across the ocean. China, once the center of the world, now stood before a mirror watching itself fade. Not because foreigners were stronger, but because of faith in its own unchanging nature. An empire that seemed eternal was falling into the hands of the very thing it had always despised, the market and desire. No cannon ever fired, only the sound of silver falling and white smoke slipping through wooden doors. Sometimes a civilization is not conquered. It simply lulls itself to sleep. While the Qing court was still arguing over whether to ban or tolerate opium, on the other side of the ocean, a group of men had already turned it into an empire. Two Scottish merchants, William Jardine and James Matheson, joined hands to build the most sophisticated smuggling network in Asia at the time. Their names would later become symbols of an entire era, a time when smuggling became policy and morality was replaced by profit. They were not generals, they carried no guns, but every ship they owned was like an invisible army, holding crates of opium from India, sailing toward Canton, with the British flag waving on the mast like a quiet challenge. They knew exactly how to dodge Qing law, anchor offshore, move goods by small boats, use Chinese intermediaries so no official could arrest anyone directly. Transshipment hubs appeared, especially Linton, a small island at the mouth of the Pearl River, where thousands of chests of opium changed hands every year, under the helpless gaze of Qing officials who could only shake their heads. From there, a whole Western pipeline formed. Britain, America, Portugal, everyone wanted a slice of the profit. Companies with elegant names, Dent & Co. and Russell & Co. Gilman, were import firms on paper, but in truth they were legal fronts for narcotics trade. The flow of money grew stronger each year. In his reports to London, Jardine wrote, "China cannot remain closed forever. Once demand has taken root, no weapons are needed, only supply." A line cold as steel and more accurate than any prophecy. Men like Jardine and Matheson did not see human beings inside the addiction, only numbers on ledgers. What they bought and sold was not just a drug, but the will of a nation. For every chest of opium burned in Canton, 10 more would arrive the next night. And while white smoke spread through Chinese streets, in Hong Kong, then still just a small harbor, Western men raised their glasses in celebration, because they knew this was only the beginning. None of them knew that a few years later, the empire they were draining would rise in resistance, and the world would learn a new phrase, the Opium War. History does not always need heroes or villains. Sometimes it only needs people who are too good at calculating. In times of disorder, sometimes history only needs one clear-minded person. By 1839, when opium smoke had spread from the imperial capital to the countryside, the Qing court finally had to choose someone to extinguish that invisible fire. That person was Lin Zexu, a strict, incorruptible official known for one thing, integrity. He was not a general. He commanded no fleets, carried no cannons. All he had was a belief that law and moral duty could save his people from deception. When he received the Emperor Daoguang's decree, Lin Zexu bowed and said only one sentence. "If opium is not ended, there will be nothing left to save in this nation." When he arrived in Canton, foreign merchants began to fear him. Lin Zexu immediately shut warehouses, arrested dealers, sealed ships, issued a total ban on buying, storing, or smoking opium, and wrote directly to Queen Victoria, a letter soaked in moral clarity. "Would you dare let your own people become addicted to the poison you bring here?" No one replied, only the sound of waves striking hulls near Linton, where hundreds of chests of opium still passed hand to hand. In June 1839, Lin Zexu surrounded the foreign depots, forcing all British traders to surrender their opium stocks. After days of tense standoff, 20,283 chests were handed over. And for 23 consecutive days, people watched each chest poured out at Human, dissolved with lime, so it could never be used again. It was the largest drug destruction in human history, an act that felt like both fury and a prayer. Thousands stood on the shore, watching the cloudy water flow into the Pearl River, and perhaps, in that moment, China believed it had awakened. But across the ocean, Britain did not see righteousness. They saw an insult to trade interests. Steel-clad warships began to leave from India, Union Jack flags snapping in the wind on their decks. One honest official had lit the fuse for an unequal confrontation. And from here, history turned the page. A page where morality would stand face to face with cannon fire. In June 1839, Guangdong's air was heavy and hot. The wind carried the smell of salt from the sea, mixed with the sharp scent of lime and the fading smoke of opium being poured into the river. At Human, thousands of people lined the shore, watching in silence as each chest was pried open. Gray-brown opium cakes falling out, dissolving in boiling lime and white waves. 20,283 chests, a number no one could believe. Each chest meant dozens of kilos. Each kilo meant hundreds of addictions. Each addiction meant a family broken. And now, all of it was drifting toward the sea. Lin Zexu oversaw the destruction for 23 days. He gave no speeches, made no show of anger. He simply stood and watched the white smoke rise, as if watching a stained soul being washed clean. Soldiers worked in shifts, stirring lime, pouring water, mixing until every last trace was gone, until no scent of resin remained, only the salt of river water. The people applauded, slowly, not loudly, as if thanking justice itself. To them, this was not just the burning of contraband, but a ritual of national repentance. White smoke rose and thinned into the sky, and for a brief moment, China believed the nightmare was over. But across the ocean, this news was met not with respect, but with anger in the British Parliament. Merchants had lost millions, and they wanted to be compensated. London newspapers called Lin Zexu an insult to the crown, and Queen Victoria, who never answered his letter of conscience, quietly prepared for war. A righteous act, but to others, a provocation. From those chests dumped into the sea at Human, the waves carried the seed of a new storm, the First Opium War. And in a bitter twist, the very place where the Chinese thought they had washed away their guilt became the place where the century of humiliation began. Sometimes, a nation does not fall because of its sins, but because the world refuses to let it rise again. The war did not begin with a bold declaration, but with the silence that followed Human. a silence so heavy one could almost hear the wind moving across the bows of the warships offshore. Those ships flew the British flag, ironclad, cannon-lined, with steam hissing in their engines like the breath of a creature from another age. Until then, the Chinese still believed their empire was firm. But after only a few early battles, they faced a brutal truth. This war did not belong to the same century. The British had long-range artillery, exploding shells, rockets, while Qing forces still used matchlocks, crossbows, and strategies already outdated for hundreds of years. Coastal cities like Xiamen, Ningbo, Shanghai fell one after another. Fortresses were blasted apart, walls crumbled, and Chinese soldiers, brave but powerless, could only look to the sky, because the enemy no longer fought with swords, but with machines and steam. Lin Zexu was dismissed, not because he failed, but because the court needed someone to blame. Meanwhile, British troops marched toward Nanjing, bombarding cities, seizing ports, forcing the Qing court to the negotiating table. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, a cold document that opened nearly a century of humiliation. China had to pay silver indemnities, open 5 ports for free British trade, cede Hong Kong, and accept extraterritoriality. Foreigners committing crimes in China would not face Chinese law. On paper, the war had ended. In reality, opium flowed more freely than ever. The ships that once carried cannons now carried cargo, and that cargo was still opium, the same thing that had toppled the empire before the war even began. No one believed any more in the celestial empire above all. The old order of central civilization versus outer barbarians collapsed with the smoke of opium and gunpowder. In London, investors celebrated. In Beijing, the sky was still blue, but hearts were gray. And in the narrow alleys of Guangdong, white smoke once again rose from the pipes. A nation that had just lost a war returned to its addiction, as if nothing had happened. There are wounds that do not bleed, but they can cost a country its soul. After the final cannon of the First Opium War fell silent, China entered a new era, an era no one had wished for. People called it the age of concessions, but in truth, it was the age of lost sovereignty. The terms of the Treaty of Nanjing flung open the door for Western powers to walk into this country without knocking anymore. The 5 newly opened ports, Canton, Xiamen, Huzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, became 2-layered cities. 1 layer for the Chinese, 1 layer for the foreigners. Above, there were clean stone streets, elegant shops, gas lamps glowing through the night, and European clubs filled with piano music and red wine. Below, in the dark alleys, locals crowded together, working as laborers, watching foreigners walk by as if they were in their own home. Shanghai, once just a small river town, now turned into Europe on Chinese soil. The British, the French, the Americans carved up districts, built headquarters, churches, banks. English newspapers appeared, and the Chinese learned to read the signs of the same people who had once shelled their cities. There was prosperity, but it was borrowed prosperity. The profit from trade did not flow into the imperial coffers, but into the pockets of foreign firms and Chinese intermediaries enriched by opium. Domestic industry weakened, crafts died, and layer after layer of the poor sank into addiction. Opium pipes appeared not only in homes, but inside the mansions of officials. An empire once proud above all nations now survived on taxes drawn from narcotics. From the trading houses of Shanghai to the treasury in Beijing, everything carried the smell of smoke. and people slowly got used to the presence of foreigners. They no longer lifted their heads. They simply walked with eyes down. The West called this opening trade, but to the Chinese it was a long sleep in which they no longer owned their own dream. Opium intoxication had now reached the state itself. Not only the body, but the soul of the nation was anesthetized. And when a people sleeps to the music of someone else will write the rest of its story. After the Treaty of Nanjing, it seemed as if peace had returned. But that calm was only the surface of a storm being born. Inside, China began to rot layer by layer, like an ancient tree eaten from the core by termites, while outside, foreign powers kept knocking, polite on the surface but with guns in hand. Silver, once a symbol of prosperity, was running dry. Its price soared. Copper coins lost value. Farmers suffered. Taxes grew heavier. In the countryside, fields lay abandoned. People borrowed at high interest to survive, then fell into opium to forget. A closed circle of misery. Poverty breeds addiction. Addiction deepens poverty. Meanwhile, the Qing court kept debating whether to reform or cling to the old rights. Those in power did not understand that a nation cannot be saved by conservatism. And, while the center hesitated, local provinces improvised, each acting like a small kingdom, taxing, raising troops on their own. That was when order began to dissolve. Amid that chaos in 1850 in the South, a failed farmer named Hong Xiu Quan rose up, declaring himself the younger brother of Jesus, and founded the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. Millions of peasants followed him, believing they could topple the dynasty and restore justice. But that uprising, though born of faith, soon became the bloodiest civil war of the 19th century. As internal rebellion burned, Western powers saw a new opening. Britain, France, America, Russia, each forced new treaties. More ports opened, land leased, missionaries allowed in, permission to move deeper inland, and to bring weapons for self-defense. On the map, China now looked like a fabric being cut apart, each piece dyed in a different nation's colors. Amid this disorder, Emperor Dao Guang died, leaving the throne and a shaking country to his son. The opium smoke had not yet cleared when war smoke rose again. There was no time to recover, no space to breathe. Inside, rebellion; outside, cannon fire; in the middle, an old, exhausted court. An empire once sure it was the center of the world now curled up inside palace walls, receiving news of lost provinces like knives cutting flesh. And then, as if fate insisted on it, a small pretext would ignite the Second Opium War. That pretext would be called Arrow. In the middle of internal chaos, a small incident became the spark for a new disaster. In October 1856 in Canton, Chinese authorities seized a trading vessel named Arrow, a small Chinese-owned ship flying the British flag, suspected of smuggling opium. Only a few sailors were arrested, a few flags removed, but to Britain this was an insult to the national flag. While the Qing court was still busy putting down rebellions, Britain found the perfect excuse. Just weeks later, their gunboats returned to Canton's waters, cannons roaring, smoke covering the human coast. The same place where Lin Zexu had destroyed opium 17 years before. This time, they did not come only for revenge, but to expand trade rights by force. France quickly joined the conflict, using the killing of a missionary as their pretext, and, together with Britain, formed a new Western coalition. Warships, artillery, infantry, wave after wave pushed deeper into Chinese territory. Canton fell. Then Suzhou, Hangzhou, Tianjin. At last, Western troops marched on Beijing. In 1860, the Old Summer Palace, the most magnificent garden in Asia, home to masterpieces of 1,000 years, was looted and burned for 3 days and nights by British and French soldiers. Books turned to ash. Bronze statues smashed. And in that sea of fire, one could hear the laughter of the victors and the silent despair of a civilization that once believed the world revolved around it. When the war ended, the Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Peking followed. More ports opened to foreign trade. Westerners allowed to travel inland. Permanent embassies established in the capital, and most of all, opium trade legalized. From then on, the addiction was no longer secret. It was protected by diplomatic seals and international law. A dynasty that once tried to defend morality was now forced to sign its name to legalize the very poison that had ruined its own people. The gun smoke of war faded, but the smoke of opium grew thicker than ever. Silver, power, and a nation's soul, all sold cheap for the sake of the arrow. History can be cruel. A single flag pulled down, and an entire empire collapsed. After the 2 Opium Wars, the empire that once called itself the Heavenly Kingdom was no longer the center of the world. It became a chessboard, and the great powers took turns placing their pieces. The British took the South and Hong Kong. The French claimed Yunnan and Guangxi. The Russians expanded into Xinjiang and Manchuria. The Japanese eyed Korea and Taiwan, and the Germans took Shandong as their sphere of influence. Westerners called this game slicing the Chinese melon. Each power chose a piece. Some demanded mining rights, some built private railways, some leased ports and stationed troops. And the Qing court, old, weak, and exhausted, could only sign more treaties just to preserve the illusion of existence. But the real tragedy was not only in the loss of land, but in the loss of the nation's soul. Once opium became legal, local authorities discovered it was a gold mine. Opium taxes saved the treasury, fed the army, and bought a fragile peace. The more people were addicted, the more revenue they collected. A double addiction began. Society was addicted, and the state budget was addicted. By the end of the 19th century, China had become one of the world's biggest opium producers. From the poppy fields of Sichuan, Yunnan, and Gansu, domestic output was estimated to supply up to 85% of national consumption. Hillsides turned red and violet with blossoms, beautiful to the eye, but a beauty of death. Shanghai, once the symbol of commerce, had become the capital of white smoke. Foreigners lived in luxury concessions, while Chinese citizens dozed over their pipes. Opium shops sprang up like tea houses, and in every home, every office, the smell of the drug became the scent of the age. Meanwhile, those who once trafficked opium, Jardine, Matheson, Dent, and Coulter, had now become international trading houses, respected, decorated, honored. No one remembered what they once planted. A nation, a dynasty, and hundreds of millions of people drifted in a shared dream. The poppies kept blooming under the sun, as if the country had forgotten how to wake up. Elsewhere, the world entered the industrial age. Trains rolled, electric lights glowed, airplanes were about to be born. But China, still in its stupor, sat under oil lamps counting opium tax coins and calling them prosperity. Sometimes the greatest tragedy of a people is not being conquered by others, but when they begin to feel comfortable in their own collapse. By the end of the 19th century, when the world was entering the age of steam and electricity, China lay like a patient in a fevered sleep. Opium, injustice, and humiliating treaties had drained the country's strength. But in that darkness, a small flame rose. The Boxer Rebellion, known in Chinese as the Yehetuan movement. They were peasants, fighters, the poor, people with nothing left to lose. They had no guns, no warships, only a blind faith that the spirits will protect the Han. They believed bullets could not pierce them, believed the power of their ancestors could drive out foreigners, and they rose up with sticks and blades, shouting through dust-choked streets, "Support the Qing! Destroy the foreigners!" That fire of anger spread as fast as opium smoke once had. Churches were burned, Westerners killed, and even Chinese converts were hunted and punished. The Qing court, weak and divided, first hesitated, then sided with the Boxers, calling them patriotic militias. That decision pushed the empire into its final crisis. In 1900, an alliance of 8 nations, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Russia, America, Austria, Italy, landed in Tianjin and marched straight toward Beijing. Cannons thundered, walls fell, and once again China became someone else's battlefield. When Western forces entered the Forbidden City, Empress Dowager Cixi fled in the night disguised as a commoner. The imperial court abandoned its own capital, leaving Beijing to fire, plunder, and tears. After the uprising was crushed, the great powers forced the Qing to sign the Boxer Protocol. Its terms were brutal. 450 million taels of silver in reparations, to be paid over 39 years. Foreign troops allowed to station in Beijing and key routes. Chinese citizens forbidden to resist foreigners. The Qing government forced to issue a formal apology. China lost more land, more silver, more dignity, but worse, it lost faith in itself. As the Allied forces paraded through the city gates, the people knelt, not out of respect, but out of fear. An empire that once made the world bow now bowed before the world. When the storm passed, what remained was a broken China, shot at, drained, and humiliated. And in the ashes of the old summer palace, in the smell of silver and opium, a new century began. The century of collapse. In 1911, gunfire from the Wuchang Uprising rang out, and, after more than 2,000 years of dynasty after dynasty, the Qing collapsed. The gates of the Forbidden City closed, and China stepped into a new era, the Republic. But Republic, then, was only a thin title. In reality, the country was torn apart by warlords. Each region was a kingdom. Each general had his own army, taxes, and laws. As for the people, they didn't know who the government was. They only bowed to whoever held the gun in their province. Opium still flooded the land. When treasuries dried up, warlords grew poppies, taxing the people's addiction and using the money to feed their armies. Fields of pink and purple covered the south, so beautiful one might forget they were the color of despair. By the 1930s, a new shadow fell. Japan invaded. They quickly realized that the West's old weapon still worked: opium and division. In occupied zones, the Japanese distributed opium, luring people into forgetting war through gentle hallucination. But out of that smoke, the poor awakened again. Peasants, workers, students rose up, forming the Red Army, the People's Army. They had no tanks, no heavy artillery, only rice, farmland, and a belief: if we lose again, we lose forever. They fought with the one thing the previous century had lost: will. Every citizen became the rear support. Women mended uniforms. Children carried ammo. Farmers hauled grain across mountains. In the Huaihai Campaign, 1948, millions of villagers pushed supply carts, making the enemy's modern weapons useless. A whole nation stood up, not out of hatred, but to survive. And when people stop fearing loss, they become strong in a way weapons cannot explain. In 1949, after 4 years of civil war, the People's Forces entered Beijing, and a new flag was raised. There was no grand parade, only quiet tears. Because this victory was not a win of one faction, but a win of an entire people who had suffered long enough to understand the price of freedom. In those days, people celebrated, not because they loved war, but because for the first time in 100 years, the country belonged to its own people again. And from the ruins, a promise was spoken that this generation would sweep away the ashes, heal the addiction, and rebuild from the wreckage of a century of humiliation. In 1949, the red flag with 5 stars rose over Beijing. Cheers spilled across Tiananmen Square, and for the first time in more than 100 years, the Chinese people felt that they were in control of their own land again. But within that joy, one ghost still lingered: opium. For over a century, that white smoke had not only destroyed bodies, it had destroyed trust, will, and the spirit of the nation. A new government was born, and its first mission was not to build factories, but to cut off an addiction that had lasted through 5 generations. Anti-opium campaigns began at once. Opium dens were shut down, smuggling routes dismantled. Addicts were not treated as criminals, but sent to rehabilitation and labor programs. Everywhere, new signs were hung: no opium, no slaves. Within just a few years, the substance that had held millions hostage almost disappeared from public life. For the first time, China woke up, but that awakening was not loud. It was quiet, like the breathing after a long nightmare. A whole nation rose from the ashes of a century of humiliation, with memories still burning raw, of Canton docks drowning in silver, of chests of opium dumped at Human, of the old summer palace burning red in the night, and of people kneeling under foreign flags. All of it became a collective scar, an unerasable part of modern Chinese identity. Because in that memory they learned something simple: when weak, you will be forced; when complacent, you will lose. From then on, China walked with 2 things side by side: a resurrected pride and the fear of repeating the past. Today, as towers rise into the sky, as high-speed trains cut across the plains, as China once again becomes a center of world trade, deep inside, there is still the echo of that century. A soft reminder that every light has its price. And if you are still listening now, take a slow breath, because this story, though distant, is a reminder for all of us. Strength does not come from weapons, but from the ability to stay awake inside the dream. And so, the story of opium comes to an end. A story not only about war or trade, but about people, and what happens when a civilization falls asleep in the glow of its own glory. From the golden days of Canton to the burning docks of Human, from the opium smoke in noble chambers to gun smoke at the old summer palace, China traveled a long circle to learn one simple truth: strength does not live in wealth, but in the ability to wake up after the fall. Every generation has its own opium, something that makes us forget reality, stop trying, and lull ourselves into believing everything is fine. But history does not sing us to sleep. It simply waits until we open our eyes. When we look back at that century, we should not only see humiliation, but also the strange resilience of human beings, those who stepped out of the trance with bare hands and found themselves again amid ruins. If you are still awake, take one slow breath. Inhale, that is history. Exhale, that is peace. Thank you for walking this whole path with me. If you want more nights as gentle as smoke, where history does not shout but only whispers, maybe leave a subscription, so that each night when the world falls asleep, we can still sit together and listen to the sound of time passing, softly